The cheetah hit his boat at full sprint, pregnant and bleeding black fluid, eyes screaming one word: help. Then Wells saw what was chasing her from the water, a 15-foot nightmare with glowing orange eyes and ivory tusks the size of his forearm, and he realized this wasn't a rescue mission. It was a death sentence. Before we dive into this insane story, quick question: where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button, because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Now let's get into the story. This is the story of the day reality broke for one ranger, and the impossible choice that changed everything. The Kenai River had a rhythm Wells Barahas had learned to trust. The lazy current, the distant call of ravens, the mist that clung to the water like breath on glass. He'd come to Alaska to find predictable solitude, the kind that didn't ask questions or demand explanations. Out here, checking a routine water sensor from his aluminum patrol boat, he was just another anonymous piece of the wilderness. Then the world cracked open. The sound came first. Not the snap of a twig, but the violent crack of a branch the size of a man's torso breaking under immense force. Then crashing. Frantic. Desperate. Something massive was tearing through the dense spruce forest at impossible speed. Wells's hand moved instinctively to the radio clipped to his orange safety vest, but his thumb froze over the call button. Because what burst from the tree line shouldn't exist. A cheetah, a goddamn African cheetah, exploded from the undergrowth and launched herself into the frigid Alaskan River without hesitation. Her spotted coat was slick with something darker than water, her movements powerful despite the visible swell of her pregnant belly. But it was her eyes that stopped Wells's heart. They weren't animal eyes. They were human, wide with terror, locked onto his boat with the desperate focus of someone drowning and seeing the only life raft in an endless ocean. She wasn't just running. She was fleeing, and those eyes were screaming a single word he could hear without sound. Help! Wells opened his mouth to what? Shout? Radio for backup? Question his own sanity? The water behind the cheetah erupted. A massive head surged from the depths like a nightmare given flesh, craggy skin the color of river stones, dripping with black water and strands of algae. But it was the eyes that turned Wells's blood to ice. Two glowing orange embers that burned with an intelligence that was wrong, fundamentally wrong, for any creature that should exist in nature. Twin ivory tusks, each as long as Wells's forearm, jutted from a jaw that unhinged with a sound that was part bellow, part roar, part something Wells's brain refused to categorize. The thing was hunting, not with the mindless hunger of a predator, but with the focused intent of an executioner pursuing a specific target. The cheetah didn't slow. She ran through the shallows with a gait that defied the water's resistance, every muscle straining, her swollen belly swinging with each bound. 20 yards from boat. 15. 10. Wells's training screamed at him. Start the engine. Get away. Radio for. The cheetah leaped. 500 pounds of desperate, pregnant predator launched herself through the air in a final, impossible bound. She hit the aluminum hull with an impact that nearly capsized the boat, her claws scrabbling for purchase on the slick metal floor. Wells threw himself backward, his skull cracking against the outboard motor, stars exploding across his vision. The creature bellowed in rage, a sound that vibrated through the boat's hull and into Wells's chest cavity like a physical blow. It was close, so close Wells could smell it. Rot and ozone and something chemical that burned his nostrils. Then silence. The thing sank beneath the black water, leaving only expanding ripples, and the impossible image burned into Wells's retinas. Glowing eyes disappearing into the depths, still watching, still waiting. Wells lay sprawled in the bottom of his boat, chest heaving, orange vest bunched up around his neck. The cheetah collapsed 3 feet away, sides heaving, her amber eyes, those horribly human eyes, fixed on his face with an expression that transcended species. "Thank you. Please, don't let it take me." Wells's hands shook as he pushed himself upright. His radio crackled with static. Standard check-in from base, routine and oblivious. His thumb hovered over the transmit button. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Barajas. I have a situation. Requesting immediate." The cheetah made a sound, soft, pleading, almost like a whimper. She shifted, and Wells saw the wound on her hind leg. 2 deep, parallel puncture marks weeping in iridescent black fluid that didn't look like blood. Tusk width. Fresh. The water beside the boat rippled. Something large moved beneath the surface, circling, patient. Wells's finger released the radio button before he could speak. And in that moment of silence, he heard it, a low-frequency pulse, almost subsonic, emanating from somewhere beneath the water. Not natural, not biological, electronic. The cheetah's ears flattened, and she began to tremble. The pulsing grew louder, closer. Wells's training was a voice screaming in his skull. Invasive species. Ecological threat. Report immediately. Protocol demands. But the cheetah wasn't acting like a threat. She lay collapsed on the aluminum floor of his boat, sides heaving with exhaustion, her swollen belly rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. Her eyes, those impossibly human eyes, tracked his every movement with the desperate awareness of someone who knew their life depended entirely on the mercy of a stranger. She wasn't looking at him like prey looks at a predator. She was looking at him like a refugee looks at a border guard, silently begging, "Please, don't send me back." Wells's hand trembled on the radio. One call. That's all it would take. Fish and Wildlife. State troopers. A team with tranquilizers and protocols and answers that made sense. The cheetah's ears flattened. A soft, broken sound escaped her throat. Not a growl, but something closer to a sob. A mother's sorrow wrapped in fur and fear. His thumb released the transmit button. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "What am I doing?" But he already knew. He'd made the choice the moment he didn't call it in. Wells killed the engine and let the current carry them downstream, away from the main channel, toward the network of hidden tributaries only rangers knew existed. The water beneath them stayed dark and still, but Wells felt eyes watching from below, patient, calculating, waiting. 20 minutes later, he guided the boat toward his ranger station, a small cabin on wooden stilts jutting over the riverbank, isolated and off-grid. It was supposed to be his sanctuary from the world. Now it was a hiding place. He helped the cheetah onto the dock. She didn't fight him, just leaned her considerable weight against his legs, limping badly. Inside the cabin, she collapsed immediately onto the worn rug, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Wells grabbed his first aid kit, hands shaking as he knelt beside her. "Okay, girl, let me see what we're dealing with." The wound on her hind leg made his stomach turn. 2 deep, perfectly parallel puncture marks, each the diameter of a quarter, weeping a viscous black fluid that shimmered with an oily, iridescent sheen. Not blood. Something else. Something wrong. The spacing was exact, the width of those ivory tusks. Wells cleaned the wound with antiseptic, and the cheetah flinched but didn't pull away. She watched him with an expression that transcended species. Trust mixed with exhaustion, gratitude mixed with terror. As he worked, his fingers found something hard beneath the skin near the wound site. What the hell? Using his Leatherman multi-tool, Wells carefully made a small incision. The cheetah's muscles tensed, but she didn't move, didn't bite, just watched him with those pleading, human eyes. He extracted a small metallic disc, no larger than a quarter, warm to the touch and smooth as polished obsidian. Engraved on its surface was a symbol, a serpent devouring its own tail. Beneath it, precision-etched text, Ouroboros, Asset 7, Viability, Nominal. Wells's blood ran cold. She wasn't lost. She wasn't an escapee from some exotic animal collector. She was property, an asset, a product, and someone had tracked her here. The cabin's perimeter motion sensor, the one linked to his trail cameras, chimed softly from his laptop on the desk. Wells's head snapped toward the screen. The feed showed two figures in tactical gear, thermal optics mounted on their rifles, standing at the tree line exactly 200 yards from his door. Not moving, not approaching, just watching, waiting. The cheetah's head lifted, ears swiveling toward the window, and she began to shake uncontrollably. A high-frequency chirp, barely audible to Wells, but clearly agonizing to her, pierced the silence. Outside, one of the figures raised something to his mouth. The chirping intensified, and from somewhere beneath the cabin, in the dark water below, Wells heard it. A low, rumbling growl. It had followed them home. Wells killed the cabin lights and grabbed his laptop, hands shaking as he typed Ouroboros into the search bar. The satellite connection was painfully slow, each second stretching like hours while the cheetah, Cassie, he'd started calling her in his head, panted in the darkness behind him. The first results were academic papers about mythological symbolism. Useless, but deeper, buried in encrypted forums and dark web whispers. He found fragments that made his blood freeze. Ouroboros Biosystems, Black Budget Contractor, Accelerated Evolution Protocols. They're making things that shouldn't exist. Biological assets for military applications. Predators designed, not born. If you see the serpent logo, run. They don't leave witnesses. Wells's screen flickered. A new notification. Perimeter breach, camera 3. The trail cam feed, loaded in grainy, staticky resolution. Two figures stood at the tree line, 200 yards out. Tactical gear, thermal optics, suppressed rifles held with professional ease. They weren't hiding. They were announcing themselves, letting him know the trap was set. One figure raised something to his mouth, a radio, or something else, and spoke into it. The high-frequency chirp erupted from the woods, piercing and deliberate. Cassie's reaction was immediate and visceral. She scrambled to her feet, head whipping around in panic, eyes wide with a terror that was horribly, devastatingly human. She looked at Wells with an expression that screamed, "Make it stop. Please make it stop." The sound wasn't just a signal. It was a weapon, a leash wrapped around her brainstem. Wells covered his ears, but the frequency was designed for her, not him. It drilled into her skull, triggering some implanted response he couldn't see but could feel radiating off her in waves of pure agony. "I don't know how," Wells shouted, voice cracking. "Cassie, I don't know how to—" She staggered, legs buckling. Her mouth opened in a silent scream. And then she made a sound Wells had never heard from any animal, a sharp, broken cry that was unmistakably the sound of a mother in labor. Her water broke across the cabin floor in a rush of amniotic fluid mixed with that same iridescent black substance from her wound. No, 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 not now. Wells lunged toward her, but Cassie collapsed on her side, flanks convulsing with contractions. Her eyes found his, wide and pleading, filled with a terror that transcended the physical pain. My babies. Save my babies. The chirping intensified, relentless and cruel. Outside, the figures didn't move. They were waiting, watching him scramble, watching her suffer. Wells's training kicked in, partial, fragmented, inadequate. He'd done wilderness first aid, CPR on hypothermic hikers, basic trauma response. But delivering a genetically engineered cheetah in a cabin surrounded by mercenaries and a bioweapon in the water, there was no protocol for this. Cassie's body convulsed again, harder this time, and Wells saw the first cub beginning to crown. Too early, too fast. Something was wrong with the labor, accelerated like everything else about her existence. Okay, I've got you, he whispered, hands moving on instinct, grabbing towels, boiling water on the propane stove. I've got you, girl. Just breathe. A new sound cut through the night. Beneath the cabin, in the black water below, something massive struck one of the wooden support pilings. The entire structure shuddered. Dust rained from the ceiling beams. Wells froze, staring at the floor. Thud. Another impact. Harder. More deliberate. The hunters had activated their guardian. They were going to bring the cabin down. Cassie screamed, an agonized maternal sound that tore through Wells's chest as the first cub slid into his trembling hands, tiny and wet and impossibly fragile. The cabin lurched violently to the left. A support beam snapped with a sound like a gunshot. And through the window, Wells saw the orange glow of eyes rising from the water, fixated on the cabin with patient, terrible hunger. The laptop screen flashed. Incoming call. Encrypted number. Wells stared at it, cub in one hand, the other braced against the tilting floor. He answered. A cold, professional voice filled the speaker. Ranger Barajas. Return Asset 7 and terminate any biological derivatives. You have 5 minutes to comply before we remove the structure entirely. The line went dead. Cassie's eyes locked onto his, and Wells saw the question written there in raw, desperate clarity. Will you let them take my children? Another piling cracked. The cabin dropped 6 inches, and from the woods, the chirping grew louder. Wells dragged his storage chest across the door, then the desk, then anything heavy enough to create a barricade. His rational mind knew it was pointless. The hunters outside had breaching charges, tactical training, superior firepower. But his hands needed something to do besides shake. The high-frequency chirp pulsed again, louder now, relentless. Cassie writhed on the floor, her body convulsing with contractions made worse by the signal drilling into her skull. Her eyes, those horribly human eyes, found Wells through the pain, and he saw the question there, raw and desperate. How much more can I take? Wells grabbed his binoculars and peered through the window. One of the figures of the tree line held a device the size of a car battery, antenna extended. That was the source. They weren't just tracking her. They were controlling her. The signal was a leash, and they were pulling it tighter, using her own engineered biology as a weapon against her. Bastards, Wells hissed. As if in response, the water beneath the cabin exploded. The Guardian struck the pilings with the force of a battering ram. The entire structure lurched violently. Wells's coffee mug shattered on the floor. The windows rattled in their frames. Cassie screamed, a sound of pure maternal terror. and tried to drag herself toward the corner, seeking shelter that didn't exist. Boom! Another impact. The cabin tilted 5 degrees to the left. Water sloshed beneath the floorboards. Wells stumbled to the window and looked down into the black water. The orange eyes stared back up at him, glowing like embers in the abyss. The thing was massive, easily 15 feet long, its craggy body moving with an intelligence that was surgical, methodical. It wasn't attacking randomly. It was demolishing structural supports one by one. The hunters were using their bioweapon to bring the entire cabin down, to force Wells and Cassie into the open where they could be sanitized, erased, forgotten. Behind him, Cassie made a sound that stopped his heart. Not a scream, not a roar. A mew, soft, fragile, impossibly small. Wells turned. The first cub lay on the towel he'd spread, tiny and wet and perfect. Gold fur matted with birth fluid, black spots already visible, eyes squeezed shut. It was no bigger than a kitten, and it was alive. Cassie immediately turned her attention to the cub, licking it clean with desperate, maternal focus, even as another contraction racked her body. Her eyes met Wells's for one brief second, and in that glance he saw something that shattered every wall he'd built around his heart. Gratitude, hope, trust. She was thanking him. The second cub came faster, sliding into Wells's waiting hands with a rush of that strange black fluid. This one was smaller, struggling to breathe. Wells cleared its airways with his finger, rubbed circulation into its tiny chest the way he'd been taught with hypothermic patients. Come on, come on. The cub gasped, coughed, breathed. Yes. Wells placed it beside its sibling, and Cassie pulled both cubs close, her body curling protectively around them despite the agony of the signal still screaming in her skull. For one perfect, impossible moment, there was only a mother and her newborns. Then the cabin dropped. A main support piling snapped with a sound like a tree trunk splitting. The entire structure lurched violently to the right, dipping toward the water at a 45-degree angle. Wells slammed into the wall. His laptop crashed to the floor. The barricade he'd built tumbled like toys. Cassie scrambled to keep the cubs from sliding toward the tilting edge where water now lapped at the floorboards. Through the gap beneath the cabin, Wells saw it. The guardian rising, massive jaws unhinging, those glowing eyes fixed on the weak point it had created. One more hit, and the cabin would collapse entirely. They had seconds. Wells looked at Cassie, at the two tiny lives she was desperately trying to shield, at the tracking chip still sitting on his desk. And suddenly he understood. The hunters weren't coming in because they didn't need to. They had the signal. They had the guardian. They had time. But Wells had something they didn't expect. He had nothing left to lose. He grabbed the tracking chip, his spare propane tank from the storage closet, and a roll of duct tape. Cassie watched him, ears forward, and for the first time since she'd landed in his boat, he saw something new in her eyes. Hope. Wells smashed the window, facing away from the boat. The guardian bellowed beneath the cabin. The hunter's radio crackled. 30 seconds, Ranger. Make the right choice. Wells looked at the cubs. Perfect, innocent, impossible. He thought of the person he'd failed to protect years ago. The reason he'd come to Alaska. The guilt that had driven him into isolation. Not this time, he whispered, and threw the propane tank into the woods. The chirping signal locked onto the tracking chip taped to the tank. The guardian's orange eyes swiveled toward the new source. And from the tree line, Wells heard the first scream. If you believe that the greatest courage is found not in running from the past, but in protecting the future, even when it costs you everything. Like and share this story. Subscribe now for more stories like this. Also, check out the 2 videos showing on the screen right now, specially crafted for you.